we are going to continue with one of our guests. She's Sawsan Asfari. And as previously stated, Sawsan is the founder of the Galileo Foundation. She's also co-founder and trustee of the Asfari Foundation, which aims to help young people make a valuable contribution to society by empowering them through education, research, and the power of free thinking. In addition to this, she's a board member of the US Middle East Project, advisory board member of Challenge to Change, and member of the Palestinian development organization, the Welfare Association. She's also the founder of Cookon Films. So welcome, Sawsan. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Shall I start? When we speak about everyday resistance, the existence of the Palestinians in itself is an act of resistance. To go through the checkpoints in order to get to work or to school or to see family who live in another area, that's in itself activism every day. Everyday resistance is when they take away part of your land, but you still try to harvest the other part. Or when you try to pick the olives in harvesting season and the Israeli settlers shoot at you while the army watches and does nothing. Resistance is women embroidering dresses to keep the traditional Palestinian dress alive, with each dress representing a different village. Everyday resistance comes in all forms. It's in the goal of keeping the young people educated, engaged, and active in their communities. However, today I'll be speaking mainly about the position of the Palestinian citizens in Israel, their activism and everyday resistance. Though I do need to put some historical facts and context first. The 1917 Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government that allowed the establishment of Palestine as a Jewish homeland, and that set the stage for the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages by Zionist forces, which culminated in the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Ghada Karmi, the Palestinian writer, cites in her book entitled Married to Another Man, that in the 1880s, two German rabbis were sent by a Jewish fund to explore Palestine as an option for a Jewish homeland. They said on their return, the bride is very beautiful, but she's married to another man, meaning Palestine already belonged to another people. But this fact is today ignored. We often hear that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. This historical revisionism serves as a cover for the erasure of indigenous culture, the theft of land, the plundering of Palestinian libraries, the decimation of Palestinian cultural sites and villages. This occurred on a major scale and continues today. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, about 150,000 Palestinians remained within Israel's borders. Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel in 1969, was asked, "What will you do with the Arabs in Israel?" She answered, "The old will die and the young will forget. Though the old have died, the young have certainly not forgotten." If anything, time and technology has helped the Palestinian minority in Israel to better organize themselves and connect with the Palestinians in the West Bank, the diaspora, and the world at large. The internet and social media sites have helped the Palestinians everywhere make their case to the world and show that everyday abuses that they endure. Online technology has seen the increased activity of online activism, of sites such as the Electronic Intifada and several digital organizations that promote the Palestinian cause on a global level. Today, the Palestinians in Israel make up about 20% of the population. And although they are considered Israeli citizens, they are treated as second-class citizens. Jewish and Palestinian children are educated in separate but parallel systems, and the curriculum is identical. Their educational department is directed by the members of the Jewish majority, and the curriculum is decided by the authorities with little input from the Arabs. There are no maps that show pre-1948 Palestinian settlements, only Jewish ones. This aims to show that Palestine had no history of its own. There is no mention about the history or the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians or the destruction of villages. The Palestinians are portrayed quite negatively as a violent, backward people who should be grateful to the Zionist colonizers. The education system suppresses the students' knowledge and identification with Palestinians. They are required to read Zionist literature and poetry, which celebrates the establishment of this Jewish state, even though for the Palestinians, this marks the Nakba, or catastrophe, of when their Palestinian homeland was stolen and the creation of Israel was declared. The purpose of not teaching Arabic literature and authors to Palestinians is to keep their culture suppressed, preventing them from developing an awareness of a national identity and political ambitions. It is a tool by which a whole minority is controlled. The state educational system crystallizes the alienation of the Palestinian minority and reflects the character of the state. 2 years ago, with blatant disregard for its Arab community, Israel declared itself formally as a Jewish and democratic state only for its Jewish citizens, and the Arab language was demoted. The impact of this discriminatory funding has a domino effect that plays out across the board in terms of facilities, teaching quality, and class sizes. The average number of students is 18% higher in Palestinian classrooms. Basically, discrimination between the two systems affects every aspect of life. The inequalities in schooling impacts on the Palestinians' opportunities in higher education, which in turn has a knock-on effect for job prospects and the economic health of the community as a whole. The systematic discrimination is part of a regime that aims to keep the Palestinian citizen inferior to that of the Zionist citizen. When the famous poet Mahmoud Darwish was 12 years old, he wrote a poem about the inequality between the lives of Jewish and Arab boys. For that, he was summoned by the Israeli military governor and told his father would be fired from his job if he ever wrote like this again. During his lifetime, Darwish was imprisoned 5 times by the Israeli authority for reciting poetry. His poems were thought to be detrimental to Israel's security and stability. The poem was called ID Card. There are many cases of people still being sent to jail for simply writing a poem or a social media post. We have seen a great increase in resistance through poetry, literature, and social media. So how to resist this oppressive reality? There are several peaceful ways of resisting oppression. First, resistance through reclaiming land and abandoned spaces. In March 1976, there were protests against land expropriation by the Israeli government of thousands of acres that belonged to the Arab citizens of Israel. On that day, many people were killed, and this date became a landmark that serves the collective narrative of the theft of the land. And it is now commemorated as Land Day every year on the 3rd of March. Despite it being a peaceful kind of resistance, unarmed citizens are frequently shot at, despite that there is an increase in turnout every year except this COVID year. The Palestinian citizens in Israel continue to try to reclaim some of the abandoned villages, but they are always eventually cleared off the land after Israeli army intervention. However, a phenomenon has grown in the last 3 years where communities are organizing themselves and holding some of their celebrations, weddings, and religious ceremonies in their abandoned villages. They are not allowed to stay or build on the land, but these activists are using old places to reclaim heritage and memories. Palestinians should also seek international support and protection when holding peaceful protests and activities. Also, some of the international funders, such as the EU and other foreign donors, should demand financial compensation from Israel when a project that they have funded gets bombed and the infrastructure gets destroyed. If one resides in a European or Western country, one should put pressure on one's government not to practice institutionalized government censorship in support of Israel. The last few years has seen Britain's involvement in cultural repression of Palestinians through denying of visas, forcing theaters to accept certain policies, and censoring any speakers who are deemed anti-Zionist. International human rights lawyers would also be good to connect with to highlight violations of land theft. Public pressure has to be kept up to force Israel to reconsider persecution of some activists. An example of that is Dareen Tatur, a young woman who was imprisoned a few years ago for her Facebook post and a poem entitled "Resist My People Resist." She was sent to prison for 3 months, but with public Western pressure, she was released. NGOs working with the people on the ground should be supported. For example, at the Galilee Foundation, we support educational programs, but these are awarded conditional on attendance at workshops that require students to learn about Palestinian heritage, reinforcement of national identity, and community service. Visits to raised villages are organized and research into Palestinian heritage is done. The process of cultural and linguistic alienation of Palestinian youth is ongoing. And though we believe in promoting harmony in society and peaceful coexistence, we also believe that indigenous Palestinian people must be able to preserve their own culture and heritage. Our scholarship program is not just about academic support for the underprivileged students, but it is also about serving the community and educating youth to become change makers in the society they live in. Because of the disparity at the starting line, educational organizations aim to level the playing field, as they say, to allow Palestinians to compete in top universities, which will enable them to qualify for future opportunities. This is resistance and empowerment through education. To that end, there are organizations that the gallery supports that work with the Arab students to prepare them for the psychometric exam needed to enter Israeli universities. There is also a new generation of Palestinian heritage NGOs that continue organizing on a local social level, but thinking on a global one. And there seems to be a traditional synergy between heritage arts and liberation politics. The paradigm for the Palestinians is shifting. The flowering of a strong film culture, art represents a part of the state building project and is a form of resistance against the settler colonialist reality. Theater, film, cultural exchanges with the West have all helped raise awareness to the thriving culture of the Palestinian community. There are now several well-known Palestinian filmmakers who have won awards on the world stage. Directors like Anne-Marie Jasser, Hani Abu Asad, Elias Sleiman, and most recently Farah Nabilsi have all created films that tell the Palestinian story through a creative lens rather than a purely political one. Though, of course, as we all know, everything is political and the mere existence of Palestinians is political. Symbols and iconography in film have power. Salt of the Sea, a film directed by Anne-Marie Jasser, shows a Palestinian landscape marked by raised villages and ghostly settlements. In the film, the main character, a Palestinian American, spends the night in an ancient building. They are pushed out, told the site is of archaeological importance, alluding to the way history and knowledge is weaponized in service of cultural erasure. The camera here is a tool of resistance, the instrument which Palestinian artists use to disrupt the traditional narrative underpinning the Israeli state. Another director, Michel Khleif's film, Ma'loul Celebrates Its Own Destruction, shows the annual tradition certain Palestinian Christians and their descendants undertake, visiting the village they can no longer return to, now raised and buried beneath the trees. The yearly picnic is satirical, but the action is radical. As a wise Palestinian refugee utters in the film, rights do not disappear as long as someone claims them. Film is a connecting thread to a fertile memory, and education is too. So when we speak about everyday resistance, the existence of the Palestinians is itself an act of resistance. And I just want to mention here that Farah Nabilsi's short film called The Present has been nominated for the Oscars, and we found that out a few hours ago. So if you get a chance to see it, please do. Finally, I believe working closely and coordinating with Israeli Jewish organizations that believe in human rights, justice, and equality of citizens is the key to moving forward. Organizations such as Beit Salem and several other Israeli NGOs are making headways in the West and globally and representing an alternative view of the future, a more just and equal existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Sawsan.